Good afternoon and welcome to today's Schiller Institute meeting entitled Reconstructing Haiti is America's Way Out of the Global Britain Trap. Today's symposium is an attempt to implement the concept of the coincidence of opposites. It's a committee that has been formed by Helga Sepp-LaRouche as of June of last year. It came from an idea actually addressing the questions that had surrounded the George Floyd murder at that time, but then were seen by Helga and by others as being much of a world historical importance, much more fundamental to everything that was happening in the world, including the then new coronavirus pandemic. What we're doing here is we're bringing together people from different groups and experience, combining in a discussion to forge a pathway forward out of crisis. Today's specific focus will be a recently drafted Schiller Institute program on the development of Haiti, which what we're doing in this case is we're talking to various people to make sure that what we're talking about here is informed by not only the view of others, but the notion of what can actually be done in the short and long term as well, and how that fits into this international perspective. Now, to refer to that international perspective, what we're going to first see is part of a webcast that was done by Helga Sepp-LaRouche. She addressed this issue of global Britain. We want to make sure that people have an idea what we mean by that. And so we start with that first excerpt from Helga. This is from this past Thursday.
Well, you mentioned two aspects of the targeting of Putin and Xi Jinping, with the Putin Chatham House and the attack on Xi Jinping definitely coming from escalated by Murdoch, who's been identified for a long time with British intelligence. The Russian security official, Patrushev, openly identified this as a British Empire strategy.
Yes, I think the role of the British is coming more into focus because it is very clear that the whole idea of global Britain, the role of the British after the Brexit, in alliance with the United States to try to recreate the unipolar world, which is impossible, obviously, but based on the special relationship between the United States and Great Britain, and then relying on essentially the Commonwealth countries to go into this confrontation. It is a revival of the British Empire, and that is what people should recognize.
Now, we're bringing up an issue that for many people might seem to be esoteric. What do you mean a revival of the British Empire? Well, if you weren't following the news of this week, you may not have noticed that there had been this announcement, actually over the last 2 weeks, of this new alliance between Great Britain, Australia, and the United States in the Indo-Pacific, involving the sale of a group of nuclear submarines. And many different countries are commenting on this, with the most important comment coming from the Russians. We will go back to that in a moment. But what's relevant here is that there's an idea about having a different kind of policy than the military strategies that have been the characteristic, really, of the world, particularly since the period of 9/11. Just to say, Helga did mention the Secretary of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, Nikolai Patrushev. And here's the statement that he made in response to the announcement of this new maritime pact between Australia and the United Kingdom and the United States. He said, "The English for centuries pushed the Scots into the mountain regions, used cheap labor, and brought Irish people to the colonies in the capacity of slaves. These people for centuries were treated with no less contempt than the Africans or Asians subjugated by Britain." And there's this importance to this to think about concerning Afghanistan. Afghanistan, as people should know from history, had been the bailiwick of British intelligence and failed British military adventures for well over a century prior to the entry into Afghanistan over a period of time, not of the United States merely, but of the United States in the form of Zbigniew Brzezinski's secret war, starting back in 1979 with Russia. And the theater for that was Afghanistan. At that point, we referred to what we today call the Taliban as the Mujahideen. the fiercely independent Afghan freedom fighters with whom we were unified and united. And there was a 10-year war with the Russians, which was said to bleed them to death and so on. It was a great victory. And as we began to leave, people began to say things about what about the problem that we may be leaving a gigantic problem behind. For example, famously, the congressman from Texas, Charles Wilson, talked about that and couldn't get anybody to listen to the idea that something much more ominous had been created ostensibly during this period of this secret war run by American intelligence agencies largely in Afghanistan, but with the assistance and particularly the psychological insight and the intelligence capabilities of British intelligence. That's how that war was run. Now, everybody just acted like that wasn't a problem, and that people like Osama bin Laden, who was an ally of the United States as well, these other people weren't problems. And then 9/11 happened, and all of a sudden it was called the Taliban, the terrorist Taliban, so forth and so on. It was something which is itself a very complex phenomenon. There is no one Taliban. There's no one process going on. Now, to say something about this, Helga Seplerush also referred to this and talked about this issue of the Afghanistan policy. She made a bold, controversial proposal during the period of her discussion. We're going to take a look at that now.
I want to then look at what happened, what's going on around Afghanistan, including what's going on at the United Nations. The humanitarian situation there is worsening. The U.S. is still keeping a freeze on money that's actually the money of the Afghan nation. What's the story there? What's happening with that?
Well, it is an outrage, you know. I mean, this is money which was practically stolen by Janet Yellen, you know, the Treasury Secretary. She decided to, you know, basically keep this money, which belongs to the Afghanistan people. It doesn't belong to the United States. But this is a kind of a colonial grab. And this is incredible because this will cause many people to die because, as we discussed previously, as David Beasley from the World Food Program said, more than 90% of the people are food insecure. 28 million are not eating enough. 4 million are about to die if, you know, in the coming winter under present conditions. Then you have from the health minister, Dr. Walid Mashrou, who says that after the so-called donor countries froze the money to the humanitarian aid money to Afghanistan, there are now more than 90% of the people without medical supply, and that with a fourth wave of COVID coming. So you have people having not enough to eat, having no money, no medical supply. The banks have no money. People can't buy anything. They can't import. This is genocide. I mean, you can't do this, you know. And you know, this is the kind of you know, behavior that anybody who knows about that, and essentially everybody can know about it because it's in the media, I mean, is condoning genocide, and it must be said like that. We, among ourselves, discussed in the last days the notion of depraved indifference. This is when you know that somebody is in need and you're not helping, you are committing a crime. You know, in Nuremberg, it was discussed, people knew or should have known, you know, and in the same way, you cannot do that. I mean, who is Janet Yellen that she can decide to keep that money, which is the lifeline for people in utter needs? So I think this has to stop, and all the countries around, you know, are demanding it. The president of Uzbekistan, Mirziyoyev, he said this freeze has to be unfrozen immediately. The Pakistani demanded it. Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, all are demanding that this money be given to the Afghanistan people. And if the Taliban are now the government, then they are the representative. Also the Taliban have asked to speak at the United Nations. Afghanistan is scheduled to be the last speaker at the present UN General Assembly. And, the Taliban speaker, Shahil, said that the Taliban absolutely welcomes China's role in the reconstruction of Afghanistan. They hope that the Belt and Road Initiative will lead to the economic reconstruction of the country. As we have discussed it, this was the subject of discussion at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting a couple of days ago. So there are, from the neighbor countries, clear different signals. They have an absolute interest that the situation in Afghanistan stabilizes, that that the horrendous humanitarian crisis be addressed and real economic reconstruction occurs. And this is in stark contrast to some other countries like the European Union, unfortunately, who basically, could not care less about the suffering of the people. I mean, right now, all the people who are talking about the rights of women in Afghanistan, they should give them food, because right now, pregnant women have no food, they have no medical attention, and therefore all this talk about women's rights is just a complete baloney, which has no substance to it, and it's just a propaganda. It's really very upsetting. It's very, and people just swallow all of this. People say, what do I have to do with Afghanistan? Well, you have everything to do with Afghanistan. The so-called West was fighting there for 20 years. The United States, Germany, NATO countries. So they left a mess, an unbelievable mess. So it's your responsibility, it's our responsibility to help to address the situation and undo the damage. That is what Afghanistan has to do with you and with us and the whole world.
Now, nobody is denying that Afghanistan is a complex situation. The United States was there for 20 years in an occupation, and the Russians were there for 10 years prior to that. And in addition to that, you have 6 nations that border it. And one of those nations, of course, is China, which means that the United States military was on the border of China for 20 years, something that I don't think a lot of Americans recognize. But it's also the case that clearly the Taliban is a problematic formation. Governments have not wanted to recognize it in different ways and so forth. But we're talking about $9 billion, which, from the standpoint of whether or not that would be used for the purposes for which it was intended, is something that can be closely, minutely monitored in many different ways from various countries around the world. So there's actually no issue involved except for one. This would be a change in the policy, not merely toward Afghanistan. It's a change in the whole way that we think about policy. What we're proposing to do today is take a situation which is far less complex and far older from the standpoint of the actual violations of humanity that have gone on, and that is the nation of Haiti. Now, this is a different situation. This is a situation in which, in fact, what has been the case is that for over 200 years, there's been an oppressive policy against a nation, a black nation, which made successfully a revolution at the same time as the American Revolution, and which caused a controversy among the revolutionaries of America. Alexander Hamilton and John Adams supported the Haitian Revolution. They did it in certain ways, but were very clear about it. And that's pretty clear in the exchange of letters, for example, between Toussaint Louverture and John Adams. We'll perhaps talk about that a little bit more during the questions or discussion period. But in other words, the United States was very clear. Those two people, Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, was absolutely not under any circumstances going to recognize a black republic anywhere in the world if he could help it. And so this is a key idea. It was not just only a question of racism. It was a question of a change in the axioms of what people believed about what made someone human. Back during 1989, when he was a prisoner, actually in the Alexandria jail, Lyndon LaRouche gave an interview, and the interviewer was asking him a particular question concerning the differences between people. And he gave an answer at that time. I want to put that answer in as a discussion item because we're here talking about things at the United Nations. In fact, I believe that today the Russians speak and Haiti also speaks today at the United Nations. And just from the standpoint of talking or sort of situating how we come to this discussion, what it is we're trying to talk to today about. We're going to play that an audio excerpt from him and then go into our discussion of our policy, or the policy we're proposing. And then we have a series of people who are on. Now, let me say one thing so this is very clear at this point. The views expressed, including the ones you've just heard, the ones you're about to hear, and so on, are the views of the people that are saying them. There will be other views by other people who do not necessarily endorse the views that you're hearing. The whole purpose of today's discussion is that you must begin to bring together people who are opposite or different or have different views, which may sometimes seem to be contrasting. You have to do that because that's the only way we're going to forge our way out of the circumstance. Unless we can talk to China, to Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Iran, and Pakistan, for example, you're not going to get anything to happen in Afghanistan for the benefit of anyone. All of those countries are also concerned about terrorism. All those countries are also concerned about problems of people coming across the borders and instability of various types. So something has to be actually forged that is not going to be what anyone expected. It's going to be different than what everyone originally thought. And it's the capacity for people to work together to those kinds of ends that is essential. And so to discuss something about where you start, we're going to play this short excerpt.
The confusion in the United Nations or between different business people around the world, when they confront another culture, for example, Arabs like to stand closer to Westerners than Westerners are used to. You know, that kind of anthropological discussion of gestural communication, which causes confusion between cultures. Like certain cultures, if you touch them on the shoulder, it means something totally different than what we would mean in our context. What do you think of that kind of knowledge brought into the political? Well, just
well, I think it's really not too important. As a matter of fact, if it becomes functionally important, it's because you haven't done the most important thing. Essentially, all human beings are the same. Essentially, huh?
Though there is a lot of schools of thought that would disagree with that, right? Cultural relativism.
They're all the same. Now, to establish that sameness, in fact, you have to come to an agreement about what is really important about another person or yourself.
Yes.
And if the two of you agree about what's important about all human beings, then you find in each other that which you love and admire the most. Now, if you've done that sort of thing, if you say, all right, we're human, your child is human, I enjoy the development of your child, even though you come from a different culture, as much as a child from my culture, I get pleasure from seeing your child develop.
Yes.
Then you don't care about these secondary nuisances so much. And if they become bothersome, you can cope with them from a higher standpoint. I'd like to write to you, I have many of my friends who say come from Buddhist cultures in Asia.
Yes.
So, shall I let the differences among different kinds of Buddhist culture, and there are some pretty strong ones, as between the lesser vehicle and greater vehicle, or between the Japan variety of Buddhists and some others I know. So I'll let that stand in between us, and let these little bothersome details, differentia of habit, get between us. I have to be a little bit sensitive, watch for them, be aware of them, learn about them, recognize them when they occur. But if we are, my friend and I, in each of these cases, if we understand what is fundamentally important about being human, we have something which ties us together so strongly that these little secondary problems we work out quite comfortably.
Right, so that without an understanding in our education of the basics, that's why cultural relativism and the thought forms that come out of that get in the way, kind of a, smoke in the eyes.
What parent who loves a child wishes the child to live with a 25 or 30-year life expectancy of misery? And if the culture in which they're misery, and they find that in our culture we can give them something which leads in a different direction, most of them would be quite happy with that. It's a matter of showing love and respect for people of different cultures, showing what we call goodwill. And if we have something to give them, and we give it to them in that spirit, they generally will receive it in that spirit. There may be a lot of fussing about that, but we fuss with our closest friends about ideas when we really like each other. We'll get into terrible fights about things which we finally come to agreement on. So what's wrong with that?
Right. So that's why you would disagree with such approaches, strategies as appropriate technologies.
Right.
That's where you're exaggerating.
I like to see a human mind develop. I like to see a child playing with blocks, and like to see the light illuminating the entire personality of that child with joy. When the child realizes that it has made a discovery, which is its own original discovery as far as it's concerned. It wasn't taught its discovery. It learned it by itself through its own powers, and it sits there in absolute delight that it's learned what it is for that child, a new principle. I love that. And I think most other people love that in human beings.
And you don't think that kind of knowledge is culturally conditioned in the West, to be a Western form of knowledge?
No, it's not as such. All over the world. I see people in Africans, I've seen Indians, I've seen Southeast Asians and so forth. And it's a universal thing. Anyone who loves their children, as we love our children, even in their own terms of reference, the very possibility of the kind of love which is called in the original New Testament Greek, which is called agape, or in Latin caritas, or in the King James version is called charity. That quality of love expressed by a parent toward a child, in any culture in which that is a value, we have immediately, in terms of that point of reference, something in common to work from.
Okay, at this point, what we want to do is now bring up our panel for discussion. And what's going to happen is we're going to start off with a report from Richard Freeman, Economics Desk of Executive Intelligence Review. He's largely the author and the coordinator of what we put together. There's a team that worked on it, and there's some of the people that will be contained in the panel will also be on. But I'd like, if we could, to see if we can bring everybody up on screen. And that is, we have Richard Freeman. I see him there. As I just said, Economics Desk of EIR. I see Joel Dijon, Haitian American engineer, been in the United States 50 years, worked as a defense contractor, and has been very active both politically and so on, particularly down in the Houston, Texas area, both with Schiller Institute and with LaRouche otherwise. We've got Firmin Bakker, electrical engineer, scientist by trade, co-founder and president of Haiti Renew Alliance. And I don't see Eric Wolcott. Maybe he'll be up on the screen, or we'll be back to him, but I'll just reference him. Institute of Caribbean Studies and the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Corporate Development for that organization. I think he'll probably be with us as we start. So what's going to happen is that Richard will start off with you, and then we'll go into the discussion, responses, and disagreements, criticisms, whatever it might be. Okay.
Good. Thank you, Dennis. As any moral or caring citizen would have been horrified by the photos that splashed across international media over September 18th and 19th, showing upwards of 12,000 Haitian migrants huddled in a squalid condition under the Del Rio International Bridge in Texas. That goes from Texas to Mexico. And they were desperately hoping to get asylum in the United States. After the horrific January 12th earthquake in 2010 in Haiti, tens of thousands of Haitians fled their destroyed nation and took refuge in other Ibero-American nations, in Cuba, in the United States, in Canada, and so forth. And they were there with a rumor spread that they could get protective status, and they came to the bridge. The rumor was not true. Nonetheless, what happened was the Biden administration, which claims that they have a humane immigration policy, began loading Haitians like cattle onto daily flights. And you may have seen, I think probably most people have, various Border Patrol on their horses using the reins to herd Haitians across the border. And then they would be taken on these flights. Many of them did not know where they were going. They were shackled by the waist. They were shackled by the foot. They were shackled by the arm to their seats. and they were sent back to Haiti. And there have been 6 flights a day, escalating to 7 flights a day. To send people back to Haiti. To our knowledge, this is the only population that has been herded out and deported immediately by plane. Think for a second. This conjures up a parallel image. Shackled Africans being led onto British slave trading ships owned by the Royal Africa Company, being sent into a lifetime of chattel slavery. Now, that this should happen is an outrage. But that this has been the policy of the West to Haiti for decades is the greater outrage. And that this has become the part of the policy which has led to the devastation of Haiti is part of that picture. What I'm going to present parts of, and we will be publishing it this week in our magazine Executive Intelligence Review, is a plan for Haiti, for Haiti's development, Schiller Institute's plan for Haiti development. It's not complete, and we are benefiting from the input of many people, and we will keep working on it. But it deals with the essentials. We deal with the questions of types of infrastructure, which we will go into in a moment. I would like to thank Thurman Bakken, who was you introduced to, and others, many numerous people, who made contributions to this. And I'd also like to thank Cynthia Rush, who worked endlessly and tirelessly on this project. We have a mission. This project for Haiti is going to change the agenda for the Western Hemisphere and for the world. We must bring development. The plan is a plan for that development, but we must bring development to Haiti and end at least 125 years of genocide by the City of London, by Wall Street, by French banks, and the International Monetary Fund, to create a condition in which people are not able to live. Now, let me just give a little bit of example of that so that people understand this. And the way you deal with this is you build infrastructure, also modern industry and agriculture. All those things are possible. And I would say that people may say, well, why Haiti? Well, there's 3 reasons, and I'll get to those in a moment. But the failure to address these infrastructure deficits has created the following situation. Haiti's a nation of 11.25 million people, has the highest mortality rate for infants, the highest mortality rate for children under 5, and the highest mortality rate for mothers giving birth in the entire Western Hemisphere. And in fact, they surpass many nations in Africa. Life expectancy is 64.3 years, the lowest in all of in the Western Hemisphere. 40% of the labor force has been reported to be unemployed. It's actually much more than that if you count what the informal economy is. 59% of Haiti's population earns less than $2.3 a day as a wage, which means they're driven below the level of existence. You don't live on $2.43 a day. Poverty is 60 to 80%. The United Nations World Food Program, which Dennis referenced with regard to Afghanistan, reports that 4.4 million Haitians, that's 42% of the population, are food insecure, meaning that they are a few days' meals away from potential starvation. And last year, Haiti registered 104th out of 107 countries on the Global Hunger Index. Now, this cannot be fixed by fixing this little thing here and that little thing there, because many of those things don't exist. You can't repair what doesn't exist, but they can be built. And you have a Haitian intelligentsia, which has a tremendous capability in this situation. So I'd like to just show you one quick graphic, please. David, the first one. These are just parameters. They're taken from the UN, World Bank. You can see where the sources are. And it compares Haiti, which is in the red, to El Salvador, which is in the blue, to Spain. You can see the hunger, the first one, the poverty, the illiteracy. Then the second graphic, this is access to sanitation that will take away various things that need to be taken away, garbage, waste, water, and so forth. Electricity access, and that may be, okay, electricity access, railroads, you'll see El Salvador and Haiti don't have any, and infant mortality, which there's a few inaccuracies, in these graphics, but they are consistent and they give us the basis for comparison. They're not perfect, but that will give you one sense. Now, I'd like to say that we have a moral mission. This is not just a question of saying, well, it would be nice, let's throw in $5, let's throw in $50, and we'll send it all to some charity. That's not what's needed. What's needed is people to morally and mentally commit to this, and to make this issue sweep away the agenda of all the other stuff that's presented on the news and make it dominant, certainly in this hemisphere and elsewhere. And the Schiller Institute will do this, along with our work, which Helga Zepp-LaRouche outlined on Afghanistan, and on building a universal health system. But you'll see they're all the same, because we have to set an example. And it's also, as was said, with the question of grave indifference. You cannot sit by and let something of this sort happen and sit on your hands and say, well, it wasn't me. It is, if you don't take the responsibility. Now, Haiti and the United States, and the reason I'm going to say it has a moral responsibility for the United States, have an intertwined history. Next one, please. Now, this is Toussaint Louverture. He led a slave revolt against the French, who were brutal. He created, at the same time as we did, a republic, just a few short years afterwards. The United States republic was grudgingly accepted. Haiti wasn't. And let's be really clear, it's because Haitians are black. Louverture was taken to a French prison. He reported repeatedly that after the liberation, he was, or the first phase, he reported the conditions were horrendous. In 1803, he died of pneumonia-like effects, which could have, of course, been avoided. Louverture was working with Alexander Hamilton, the father of the United States, who wrote America's Constitution. He co-wrote Haiti's Constitution. Next, please. Now, this is Frederick Douglass, and unfortunately, because of where my picture is placed on the screen, let me just get the quote so I can read it. Frederick Douglass was the general counsel to Haiti, and minister counsel also from 1889 to 1891. He spent his life fighting tirelessly on behalf of the development and future of Haiti. And he said this at a World's Fair where a Haitian pavilion was being opened. The little community of Haiti, anchored in the Caribbean Sea, has had her mission in the world, and a mission which the world had much need to learn. She has taught the world the danger of slavery and the value of liberty. In this respect, she has been the greatest of all our modern teachers. Next, please. Hello? Yes, thank you. There are intervening steps, but the other person I just wanted to cite in this is Franklin Roosevelt. And when he greeted Haitian President Lescott at White House in 1943, and he's the first president, American president, to ever go to Haiti. He went twice. He said, "I have had the most intense interest in the Republic of Haiti and the development of its people in a way that will never mean exploitation by any other nation." And Roosevelt pushed for the development of a Haitian TVA. It was set up in the Artibonite Valley, and it led to the Pellegrin Dam after Roosevelt was dead, but he pushed for this. And it was built in the 1950s, It provides 53 megawatts of electricity. It was where it helped irrigate much of the rice production. So and there's more, but I think that when we talk about Haiti and that the intertwined histories, they're very clear. And that's why I say we have a moral responsibility. Now, let me just contrast this to something that people see. They say, okay, well, Haiti had an earthquake in 2010, 319,000 Haitians died. Lyndon LaRouche at the time said that they were given tarps to live on. Tarps, plastic strips exposed to the elements. And Lyndon LaRouche said, look, move people to a higher ground because Haiti is in a floodplain. Put them in housing. It wasn't dead. It wasn't done. And 10,000 more Haitians died from cholera. But